Welcome my channel. Tonight's story is one of those buried truths that history tried very hard to erase. It begins with a single cruel decision on a southern plantation when an overseer captured the elderly mother of an enslaved woman named Dinah, believing fear would bring obedience. What followed instead was something no one could control, a chain of events fueled by grief, rage, and a fury that refused to be silenced. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from, and make sure you subscribe, because stories like this require long hours of digging through forgotten records, testimonies, and suppressed accounts to bring the real truth back into the light. Dinah's life on the plantation had been shaped by loss long before the overseer ever noticed her name. She had been born into bondage, raised under the constant weight of forced labor, hunger, and fear, but through it all, one presence had remained steady, her mother. The woman was old, her back bent from decades in the fields, her hands knotted and scarred, but to Dinah she was more than family. She was memory, protection, and survival itself, in a world where enslaved people were stripped of names, children, and dignity without warning. Dinah's mother was the one thing that could not be taken from her, or so she believed. They worked on the same plantation, but were rarely allowed to remain close. The overseers preferred to separate families, knowing distance weakened resistance. Still, Dinah's mother found ways to be near her. She passed her scraps of food when she could, whispered warnings about cruel overseers, and told her stories at night, stories of ancestors, of Africa, of a life before chains. Those stories were more than comfort. They were quiet acts of rebellion, reminders that Dinah was a person, not property. As the years passed, Dinah grew strong. She learned how to endure without breaking, how to move through pain without letting it show. But her mother grew weaker. Age and exhaustion slowed her steps, and the overseers noticed. To them, an elderly enslaved woman was a burden, someone who produced less and cost more. Each season, Dinah feared she would be sold, beaten, or discarded. And each season, her mother somehow survived, leaning on her cane, refusing to collapse, driven by one purpose: to stay alive as long as Dinah needed her. Their bond was obvious to everyone on the plantation. Other enslaved people saw it and understood it immediately. The way Dinah always positioned herself between her mother and danger, the way her eyes never left her when the overseer passed by. The overseer saw it too, but he saw something different. He saw leverage. He saw fear that could be exploited. Dinah was known as quiet, obedient on the surface, but stubborn underneath. She worked hard, yet she never bowed her head the way they wanted. She didn't beg. She didn't cry when punished. That kind of strength made overseers uneasy. They preferred broken spirits. And the longer Dinah remained unbroken, the more dangerous she seemed in their eyes. Her mother tried to warn her. "They don't like strong women," she whispered one night as they sat near the quarters, the air thick with summer heat. "They break what they fear." Dinah nodded, but she had learned to live with fear. What she couldn't imagine was life without the woman beside her. The plantation records from that period mention an elderly female, declining productivity. That single line was all it took. From the overseer's perspective, the old woman was no longer useful, except as a tool. He began watching Dinah more closely, noting how quickly she responded whenever her mother stumbled. How her expression changed when her mother was shouted at or threatened. In his mind, the solution was simple: remove the mother, and Dinah would fall in line. But what he didn't understand was that Dinah's obedience had never come from fear. It came from restraint, from patience, from choosing survival over revenge every single day. Her mother was the anchor that kept that restraint in place. She was the voice that said, "Live, endure, wait." At night, Dinah's mother would tell her, "You're stronger than you know, child. But don't let them see it yet." Those words mattered. They shaped Dinah's silence. They shaped her calm. They shaped the fire that stayed buried just beneath the surface. The elderly woman also carried knowledge, the kind passed quietly between generations of enslaved people. She knew which overseers were cruelest, which masters were careless, which paths through the woods went unseen. She knew how quickly things could turn deadly, and she knew that survival depended on timing. To Dinah, her mother was not weak. She was wisdom itself. So when the overseer looked at the old woman and saw fragility, Dinah saw something else entirely. She saw the last barrier between herself and a breaking point she didn't yet understand. She saw the one person who had kept her humanity alive in a system designed to erase it. That's why the bond between Dinah and her mother mattered so much. It wasn't just love, it was balance. It was the thin line holding back years of swallowed rage, humiliation, and grief. The overseer thought capturing an elderly woman would be easy. He thought age meant powerlessness. What he failed to realize was that by threatening the one person Dinah lived for, he wasn't enforcing control. He was removing the final restraint. And once that restraint was gone, there would be nothing left to stop what came next. The overseer's decision didn't come suddenly. It was calculated, cold, and rooted in the brutal logic of plantation control. To men like him, fear was not just a tool, it was a language. He had learned that breaking one person publicly could bend dozens silently. And as he watched Dinah day after day, he became convinced that she was resisting him in the only way she could, by remaining unbroken. She followed orders, yes, but without submission in her eyes. That quiet defiance unsettled him more than open rebellion ever could. He began to look for weakness, something he could use to remind Dinah of her place. It didn't take long. The old woman's presence was obvious. Dinah slowed her pace to match her mother's steps. She shielded her from blows meant for weaker workers. She spoke only when her mother was threatened. To the overseer, this wasn't love, it was leverage. In his mind, enslaved people were no different from livestock. When one animal resisted, you punished it. When punishment didn't work, you threatened what it depended on. The elderly mother, frail and slowing down, fit perfectly into that equation. She was already seen as expendable. Her capture would serve two purposes: remove a burden from the fields and send a clear message to Dinah and everyone else watching. The overseer justified it easily. He told the plantation owner the woman was no longer productive, that she distracted others, that her age made her a risk. He argued that isolating her would force Dinah to focus, to work harder, to obey more completely. The owner barely listened. Decisions like this were routine. Lives were reduced to numbers, output, and convenience. With a nod, permission was given. The plan was simple and cruel. The old woman would be taken from the quarters at dawn, bound, and locked away in a storage shed near the main house, a place meant for tools and supplies, not people. She would be denied food and water for a time, just enough to instill terror, but not enough to kill her quickly. The overseer believed Dinah would see her suffering and break. He expected tears, begging, obedience. What he didn't expect was silence. When the overseer first announced that the elderly woman was being removed for discipline, Dinah said nothing. Her face didn't change. She didn't plead. That calm only reinforced his confidence. He mistook restraint for weakness, composure for surrender. He believed fear would come later. Once the reality settled in, the capture itself was brutal. 2 men dragged the old woman from her sleeping place while it was still dark. She cried out once, not in fear for herself, but calling Dinah's name. That sound carried through the quarters, sharp and raw. Dinah heard it. Everyone did. And in that moment, something shifted. The overseer ordered that Dinah be forced to watch. He believed humiliation would speed her collapse. He wanted her to see the chains, the locked door, the isolation. He wanted her to understand that he controlled not just her body, but her bloodline, her past, and her future. Dinah stood still. She didn't scream. She didn't fight. But those who were close enough saw it, the tightening of her jaw, the slow clenching of her hands, the way her breathing changed. Her silence wasn't submission. It was containment. The overseer walked away convinced he had won. He believed fear had been planted, that obedience would soon follow. He bragged later that night that Dinah would be manageable by morning. He had no idea that by choosing her mother as his weapon, he had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Because Dinah's mother had not been her weakness. She had been her anchor. And when the overseer tore that anchor away, he didn't create fear, he created release. That decision, made casually and without thought, would echo through the plantation in ways the overseer never imagined. What he saw as discipline was, in truth, an invitation to unleash years of buried grief, rage, and endurance. And once that door was opened, there would be no way to close it again. The moment Dinah's mother was taken was not loud or dramatic in the way overseers expected punishment to be. There were no crowds gathered for spectacle, no drawn-out screams meant to terrify the quarters into submission. Instead, it happened in the grey hour before sunrise, when the air was still and the plantation was half asleep. That quiet made it worse. It made it permanent. Dinah was already awake. Years of fear had trained her body to rise before the bell, before orders, before danger could find her unprepared. She heard the footsteps first, heavier than usual, deliberate, not the casual passing of field hands. Then came the sharp clink of iron, chains. That sound alone carried meaning on a plantation. It meant separation. It meant someone was not coming back the same, if at all. Her mother sensed it too. The old woman had learned to read the land like weather. She reached for Dinah's hand in the dark, her grip weak but urgent. "Stay still," she whispered, not for herself, but for her daughter. "Whatever happens, you stay alive." Those were the last clear words Dinah ever heard from her. The door burst open. Lantern light flooded the small space, blinding after the dark. 2 men grabbed the old woman before she could stand. Her body was light now, too light, and that made the violence feel even more obscene. She cried out once. Not a scream, not a plea, just Dinah's name, carried on breath that rattled with age. That single sound cut through the quarters like a blade. Dinah moved forward instinctively, but hands closed around her arms. Someone hissed at her to be still. The overseer stepped into view then, calm, almost bored. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply watched as the old woman was dragged into the open yard, her bare feet scraping against the dirt. What changed Dinah in that moment wasn't the cruelty itself. She had seen cruelty her entire life. It was the realization that the rules had shifted. This wasn't punishment for a mistake. This wasn't discipline for disobedience. This was deliberate targeting. Her mother wasn't being taken because she had done something wrong. She was being taken because she mattered. The overseer made sure Dinah saw everything. He positioned her where she could not look away. He wanted tears. He wanted collapse. He wanted her to beg. But Dinah's face stayed still. Her chest burned, her ears rang, and her heart pounded so hard she thought it might tear her apart, but nothing showed. Inside, something fractured. Not shattered, fractured. A clean break. The part of her that believed endurance alone could save her finally gave way. She understood, with terrifying clarity, that obedience would never protect what she loved. Silence would never be enough. Survival had a cost, and the overseer had just raised the price beyond what she could pay. As her mother was pulled away toward the storage shed near the main house, the old woman turned her head as far as she could. Their eyes met. No words passed between them, but the message was unmistakable. There was fear, yes, but there was also apology, regret, and something else, permission. Dinah felt it settle into her bones, the shift. The crossing of a line that could not be uncrossed. When the door of the shed slammed shut and the lock turned, the sound echoed across the plantation. It was final. It was meant to end resistance. Instead, it marked the end of restraint. The overseer walked away satisfied. He believed the lesson had been delivered. But those who watched Dinah afterward noticed the change immediately. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. She didn't rush toward the shed or throw herself at the guards. She returned to work. She lifted her tools. She followed orders with the same calm precision she always had. But something in her eyes was gone, or perhaps something had arrived. That day, Dinah worked harder than she ever had. Not out of fear, but out of focus. Every movement was measured. Every sound was noted. She watched where keys were kept. She counted steps between buildings. She noticed which guards drank too much and which ones dozed in the heat. The plantation, which had once felt like a cage, now revealed itself as a map. At night, she didn't sleep. She listened. She remembered her mother's stories, not the comforting ones, but the warnings. About patience, about timing, about how power always grows careless when it believes it has won. The capture of her mother did exactly what the overseer intended. It broke something. But he broke the wrong thing. He broke Dinah's belief that survival required submission. And in doing so, he unleashed something far more dangerous than rebellion fueled by rage. He unleashed resolve. What followed the capture wasn't chaos or panic. It was quiet. An unnatural, deliberate quiet that settled over Dinah like a second skin. To anyone watching, it would have looked like acceptance. She spoke less than usual, kept her head down, followed every order without hesitation. That was the mistake everyone made. They assumed silence meant defeat. But inside Dinah's mind, something else was happening entirely. The moment the shed door closed on her mother, Dinah began to plan. Not in bursts of anger or reckless desperation, but slowly, patiently, the way her mother had taught her to survive. Fury was there, burning hot, but it was contained, shaped into something sharper. Rage could get you killed. Planning could change everything. She started by watching. She noticed patterns she had never needed to before. Which overseer carried keys, and when he left them unattended? Which guards drank themselves into numbness after sundown? Which paths were walked out of habit instead of vigilance? She counted footsteps between buildings, memorized the way shadows fell at different hours, learned which dogs barked and which only growled. The plantation became predictable once she stopped seeing it as a prison and started seeing it as a system. At night, while others slept, Dinah lay awake listening. She learned the sounds of the place, the creak of floorboards that meant someone was walking above, the low cough of a guard who nodded off too often, the soft clatter of chains when the wind shifted just right. Every sound became information. Every detail became a piece of the plan. She didn't rush to the shed. That would have been expected. She didn't cry out or plead with the overseer. That would have satisfied him. Instead, she waited, because she understood something he never would. Fear makes people alert. Confidence makes them careless. Days passed. The overseer began to relax. Dinah worked harder than ever, volunteering for extra tasks, drawing no attention to herself. He took this as proof that his method had worked. He bragged to others that she had finally been tamed. He even reduced the watch around the storage area, convinced the old woman was no longer a threat or concern. Meanwhile, Dinah began to speak, quietly, carefully, to the other enslaved people. Not about rebellion, not about violence. She spoke about timing, about patience, about looking away when needed and remembering when it mattered. Her words were subtle, wrapped in shared suffering and understanding. She didn't ask for help outright. She didn't need to. People could see what had been done. They could feel the tension building. She also remembered her mother's lessons, not just about survival, but about consequences. Never act unless you're ready to finish. Her mother had once told her, because halfway is where they kill you. Dinah carried those words with her as she refined her plan, discarding anything impulsive, anything that relied on luck alone. Her fury didn't explode outward. It turned inward first, hardening her resolve. Every memory of her mother, bent over in the fields, whispering stories at night, warning her about cruel men, became fuel. Not for destruction alone, but for certainty. Dinah no longer wondered if something would happen. She only decided when. The plantation staff noticed changes, but misread them. They thought the tension had passed. They thought the lesson had been learned. The overseer even joked that the old woman's capture had fixed the problem. He didn't know that every day he delayed was a gift. Every hour of carelessness was another door unlocked. And through it all, Dinah never showed her hand. She smiled when spoken to. She nodded when ordered. She became invisible, the most dangerous state a person like her could reach. When she finally approached the shed for the first time since the capture, it wasn't in desperation. It was late, quiet, purposeful. She listened at the door, her hand resting against the rough wood, feeling for movement, for breath. She didn't call out. She didn't cry. She simply stood there long enough to understand something painful and important. Whatever condition her mother was in, time was running out. That realization didn't break her plan. It finalized it. Dinah stepped back into the darkness with clarity. What she was about to do wasn't driven by blind revenge. It was the release of something that had been building for years, every injustice swallowed, every humiliation endured, every warning ignored. The overseer believed he had removed a problem. In reality, he had given Dinah a reason. And once she had that reason, paired with patience and knowledge, There was no force on the plantation strong enough to stop what was coming. The quiet planning phase was over. What followed would not be rushed, and it would not be contained. The eruption didn't begin with a scream or a strike. It began with absence. One morning, a guard failed to show up at his post. At first it was blamed on drink, then on laziness. By nightfall, he still hadn't been found. The overseer dismissed it as coincidence, but unease crept in anyway, thin as a blade. Dinah watched all of it without reacting. She had already moved past the point of waiting. When the fury finally surfaced, it did so in fragments, small, controlled moments that no one could immediately connect. A storeroom left unlocked when it had never been unlocked before. Tools misplaced, then discovered somewhere impossible. Dogs refusing to track, whining and pulling away, as if confused by too many overlapping scents. The plantation's order began to fray, not in a single tear, but in dozens of careful cuts. Dinah was no longer alone in motion, though few would have named it coordination. People simply knew when to look away. They knew when to slow down, when to mishear, when to forget what they'd seen. Fury had become communal, but it wore the disguise of routine. That was its strength. The overseer responded the only way he knew how, with force. He increased punishments, shouted louder, made examples of men who had done nothing wrong. And with every cruel overreaction, he fed the thing he was trying to crush. Fear stopped working. People who have nothing left to lose are no longer controlled by threats. Dinah understood this. It was what she had been counting on. The first undeniable act came at dusk. A fire, small at first, licking at the edge of a supply shed. It was contained quickly. But the damage wasn't the wood or the loss of goods. It was the realization that someone had acted openly and walked away untouched. The overseer raged, demanded answers, ordered searches. None came. The plantation had learned a new language, one without words. That night, Dinah finally allowed herself to think of her mother, not as a captive, but as a cause. The fury she carried wasn't reckless. It was righteous in its own logic. Sharpened by years of restraint, she wasn't trying to destroy everything. She was trying to end something, and endings require escalation. The overseer began to sleep poorly. He armed himself even indoors. He lashed out at shadows, accused the wrong people, trusted no one. This, too, was part of the fury's work. A man who relies on control loses himself when control slips away. His judgment failed him long before his authority did. Then came the night when fury stopped hiding. A patrol sent to check the outer fields never returned together. One man stumbled back alone, pale, incoherent. Blood on his sleeve that wasn't his. He spoke of movement where there should have been none, of figures that vanished when approached, of being watched without seeing who watched. His story was mocked, until another man failed to come back at all. Dinah did not participate in every act. She didn't need to. Fury doesn't require a single hand. It requires permission. And permission had been granted the moment the overseer took her mother. What followed was inevitable, not because of superstition or legend, but because systems built on cruelty eventually collapse under their own weight. When the overseer finally realized Dinah was at the center of it, not as a visible leader, but as the still point around which everything turned, it was already too late. He summoned her, tried intimidation, then bargaining. He spoke of returning her mother, of leniency, of forgiveness. His words came out tangled, desperate. Dinah listened without expression. For the first time, she spoke plainly. not loudly, not angrily. She told him he had mistaken silence for surrender. She told him fear had an expiration date. She told him that what he had unleashed could not be put back into a cage. The fury reached its peak not in spectacle, but in consequence. Control vanished. Orders were ignored. Guards refused to patrol alone. Work slowed to a crawl. The plantation, once rigid, efficient, merciless, became unstable, unreliable, afraid of its own shadows. That was the true eruption. Dinah did not celebrate. There was no satisfaction in it. Fury is not joy, it is release. What drove her was not revenge alone, but correction, the rebalancing of something violently wrong. When word spread that the elderly woman in the shed had died, quietly and without ceremony, the fury did not explode further. It settled, heavy, final, because by then the damage was done. The overseer's authority was broken. The plantation would never return to what it had been. And everyone there understood the truth, even if they never spoke it aloud. Capturing one old woman had awakened something far larger than a single act of cruelty. The fury had not been unstoppable because it was violent. It was unstoppable because it was justified, shared, and patient. And once it had finished its work, it left behind a lesson written not in blood alone, but in fear reversed, a warning to anyone who believed power could be exercised without consequence. What came after wasn't victory, and it wasn't peace. It was a hollow quiet that settled over the plantation like ash after a fire. The overseer was gone within weeks, officially reassigned, unofficially disgraced. His authority shattered beyond repair. No announcement was made, no explanation offered. One day his room stood empty, his boots gone, his whip missing from its hook. The men who replaced him never stayed long. Something about the place resisted control now, as if the ground itself remembered what had happened there. Work resumed, but never with the same rhythm. Orders were given and followed only halfway. Guards doubled, then tripled, yet fear lingered on the side that once wielded it freely. Plantation owners spoke in hushed tones about instability and losses, careful not to name the real cause. Records from that period grew vague. Numbers smoothed over, incidents omitted. History began its familiar work, sanding down the truth until it could pass inspection. Dinah remained. That alone unsettled people. They expected her to flee, to disappear into the woods or vanish into rumor. But she stayed, quiet as ever, working the fields with the same steady movements, her face unreadable. It was as if the storm had passed through her and left nothing visible behind. Those who knew better understood this wasn't emptiness. It was completion. Her mother's body was never returned to her. No grave was marked. No prayer recorded. That absence became part of the aftermath too, a silence heavier than any memorial. Dinah never asked where her mother had been buried. She already knew what kind of answer she would get. Instead, she carried memory the only way she could, inside, where it couldn't be taken or erased. The plantation itself bore scars no ledger could explain. Tools rusted faster. Crops failed unpredictably. Animals grew skittish, refusing certain paths, certain corners. New overseers blamed weather, then workers, then bad luck. None of them lasted long enough to feel secure. Control, once absolute, had become fragile. Everyone sensed it. Among the enslaved, something subtle had changed. There was no open rebellion, no speeches or declarations. But backs bent a little less. Eyes lifted more often. People understood now that cruelty had consequences, not always immediate, not always visible, but real. The story of what Dinah had done wasn't told outright. It didn't need to be. It moved quietly, passed in glances, in pauses, in the careful way people chose when to speak, and when not to. Years later, when the plantation finally broke apart, sold off in pieces, its name fading from maps, no one publicly connected its decline to that single decision to capture an old woman. But the timing was never lost on those who had lived through it. They remembered the day fear changed direction. Dinah herself faded from records the way so many did. No death date, no sale notice, just a name that stopped appearing. Some said she left when she knew it was safe. Others believed she stayed until the end, watching the place collapse under the weight of its own past. The truth, like so much else, was never written down. What remained was the lesson the plantation never recovered from. Power taken without restraint invites resistance, not always loud, not always immediate, but patient and precise. The overseer had believed suffering could be managed, that pain could be applied like a tool, and then set aside. He was wrong. Pain remembers, and sometimes it answers back in ways that undo everything built on top of it. Long after the fields were reclaimed by weeds and the buildings sagged into ruin, locals avoided the land at night. Not because of ghosts in the theatrical sense, but because places where injustice peaks tend to hold a kind of weight. Stories linger there, even when names are forgotten. Dinah's story survived not as a legend of destruction, but as a warning carried forward that love, once violated, can become something far more dangerous than hate, and that the aftermath of cruelty doesn't end when the shouting stops. It begins when silence returns, and nothing is ever the same again.